Hello, everybody. So today we're going to talk about, you know, the kind of language that we could, in the future ultimately develop in order to talk about psychedelic experiences, more broadly, exotic states of consciousness. Of course, why the current language that we have to a large extent is, very insufficient, is not optimized for talking about, exotic mediums of thought. But, I am a epistemological optimist. So I think we actually have a good chance if we develop the math and the grammar and the syntax for these. I think we can do a lot of progress. It's one of the things that hopefully we will get to do, at least in this lifetime. Here's the hoping. Okay, but first, the quality of the day is silence, and I highly recommend. If you don't have them already, I do think it's very good to have on hand always earplugs and, things such as these. I think decibel defense. I forgot how they're called, but basically, very, very heavy duty sound blockers. And also things like, eye masks, and you can stack them. I mean, you can put, I don't know, that sounds so much like biohacking. You can stack these interventions. You can stack earplugs. And add to them decibel defense, and you'll get 30 decibels less together with 30 decibels for a total of 60 decibels less. And frankly, it actually makes a difference. If you go to a place like the BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit, it does go all the way to something like 100 decibels, and it's a dissonant sound on top of that. It's pretty horrifying. So, bring it down to like 70 decibels makes it totally fine, totally tolerable, just like no pain or suffering associated with it, but it's still distracting. Stack another 30 decibel reduction and, you could actually meditate very peacefully and be totally fine in the BART that way. No ear damage or any sort. Anyway, silence is really important. There is this really fantastic meditation teacher and scientist, Shenzin Yang, that I've been consuming a lot of his lectures recently. He has like a lot of really, really interesting videos on YouTube. One of the most wholesome contents you could possibly consume in YouTube is my assessment. Very helpful, I think, for mental health and happiness and understanding consciousness. And, one of the things that he talks about, among many, is this technique of focusing on silence, which is that oftentimes during the day you may feel overwhelmed with sensory input, especially if you have something like mild autism or OCD or something like that. Yeah, it can be pretty overwhelming and hard to deal with. But basically what he says is that in any of those situations you can usually find some aspect of your experience that is in a restful state, such as, for example, dark visual field, or kind of these like dark tactile peaceful feel, or silence in the auditory field. And just find something that is kind of in rest mode and focus on it, and then try to slowly spread that silence elsewhere. And at first this is going to be difficult, but there's kind of like this exponential progression. The more you do it, the more hours you invest in it. And advanced meditators, they could probably be at a rave at 120 decibels or something horrible like that, in terms of like long-term damage to your sensory systems, and still be able to find some aspect of their experience that is silent, and then in a sense tune into it. So it could potentially also be very helpful for pain management and things like that. For the rest of us who are not advanced meditators, actually, I think that starting in a very silent condition, like doing that type of meditation in a very, silent, sensorially deprived environment is probably going to maximize your chances of developing this skill as quickly as possible. Basically, you need a nucleation factor of silence, and I think under those conditions, you'll make the most progress at the beginning, at the very least. Now, silence is also super fascinating, because in an interview recently that we did with somebody who has been doing he did a couple of years ago, I believe, but basically Leo Gura did 30 days or 25 days of daily 5-MeO DMT experiences, and he had extremely bizarre states of consciousness as a consequence, and derealization and all sorts of things. Well, somebody messaged me recently, these like very, very nice, like older guy with like 30 years of meditation experience, and quite a smart dude. I really like him a lot. And he did a 6 months daily 5-MeO DMT experiment, and he didn't go crazy or anything. He didn't have this derealization or anything like that. But basically, he was saying that the 5-MeO DMT world, there's basically an infinite number of kind of silent states that you can experience. It's like, once in a while he would experience kind of a perfect peace, which maybe is kind of the bodily silence component, and sometimes he would experience perfect kind of a void and blackness, and that might be kind of a high dimensional visual field silence. And then sometimes he would actually experience the sensory quality of auditory silence, just encompassing everything. So in a sense, yeah, perhaps 5-MeO DMT is almost kind of helping you tune into these high dimensional silence experiences and then annealing into them, which I suspect might actually be kind of good for your nervous system if you do it right, which is a big caveat. There's tons of ways of doing 5-MeO DMT in highly traumatizing ways, so it's a whole topic. Okay, but today we're gonna talk about how to develop a language for talking about these exotic high energy states of consciousness. And I'm gonna preface this by saying that this is actually meant as a almost kind of a preamble, is an introduction to another talk I'm gonna be making, which is gonna be about consciousness in digital computers, whether digital computers can or cannot be conscious. That's a big topic. I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of feelings. I don't know, maybe some crying. I don't know. We'll see about that. But there's a lot of let's say it's a load-bearing belief. A lot of people, especially in my community, it's a load-bearing belief that digital computers can wake up if you program them correctly and you scale them correctly. And maybe I have bad news for you, or good news, depending on how you look at it. But the thing is that, for the most part, talking about psychedelic evidence on a topic like can digital computers wake up, most people will just completely and utterly dismiss it. It's like, oh, you were just tripping out, man. Like what are you talking about? Like, no, like the sensations you're talking about from psychedelia have absolutely no bearing on the discussion between physicalism and functionalism with these like highly technical, philosophical, and scientific discussion. But actually, I do believe that developing a really good language to talk about psychedelic experiences will, in fact, have a lot of bearings on questions like digital sentience. But for that, I've got to, in some sense, do the hard work of convincing you that there's actually a rational way to talk about these things, which is so difficult, and so many people fail at it. It's quite a difficult high-level task. So anyway, I'll also mention another thing is that chances are I will not say anything insightful, but what I aim to do in these videos is always aim to say a meaningful, non-trivial thing about the topic that hopefully you haven't heard elsewhere and you haven't thought before, because it's something I've thought very deeply about, and I've talked with my colleagues, and I'm really trying to kind of offer you the fruits of a lot of thought and insight, and hopefully you can see it from that perspective. It's possible I will still fail to say anything meaningful, but the spirit of it is to actually add to the conversation. A phrase I recently used is it's true that we are just barely scratching the surface of the field of consciousness, but hopefully we're scratching the surface in such a way that it's making tiny dents, so it's not a completely ineffective scratch. That's it's a non-zero progress. That is the aim that I'm making. I'm putting here. Okay, so let's get on to the topic. So 2016 or so, wrote an article called Algorithmic Reduction of Psychedelic States of Consciousness, which is about, in psychedelia, there's this zoo of effects. And if you look at a place like, Psychonaut Wiki, the effect index, you will see like, it used to be like 50 back then, but I'm sure like now it's like hundreds of like effects. And each of them seems kind of unique and special and, in some sense kind of irreducible. So back then I thought, well, it's very unlikely that, in some sense the psychedelic will contain in it, or, there's like that many extremely diverse processes that get triggered by the same molecule. So it's more likely, and, from a parsimony point of view, from an Occam's razor point of view, more likely that we might be able to, in a sense, try to rederive the zoo of psychedelic effects just based on a few basic effects put together and then looking at how they can interact with one another such that you generate all of that emergent complexity. And I think that approach is really good. I called it algorithmic reduction to distinguish it from atomistic reduction, which is just, trying to, in some sense, arrive at models that are just made of, particles and forces. Like, you don't need to assume an ontology in order to make algorithmic reductions. They live at Mars levels, at the algorithmic level of analysis of Mars levels of analysis, which it's its own thing. But basically, it's not necessary to postulate that the universe is made of atoms or something like that in order to make fruitful algorithmic reductions. And I think that's important to point out, that whatever the metaphysics may be, you can still nonetheless make progress by algorithmically reducing phenomena. And I think that's more or less what has happened in physics, over and over again, that something looked very confusing and people started proposing, fundamental features and effects that, stacked together, biohacking again in physics. Anyway, stack together these effects, you will get the phenomena that is emergent and interesting that you're very puzzled about. So back then, I basically talked about, tracer effects. I've talked about tracer effects. You move your hand around and you see kind of like copies laying around, or you see kind of replays of it. It's kind of like you move your hand and you see a replay of it, and like kind of it keeps going and so on. So that's one of them. We have a tracer tool, actually. If you experiment with these altered states of consciousness, whether through meditation or psychedelics, I definitely encourage you to take a look at the tracer tool and try to replicate the tracers that you're seeing to contribute to science. Link in the description. I don't know. It would be nice if more people started, sending data points so that we can actually make progress in that direction. But basically, the tracer tool is getting at the tracer effects, which seem to me very much of a basic effect. But then I also talked about basically these other things, which are drifting, which is like you see a face or something, and then kind of the eyes kind of like move around a little bit, or the color of an object kind of like goes outside of the object, or the edges of an object kind of like get blended with the objects outside of it, and things like that. So basically, you can think of drifting as kind of a the local binding connections that bring together the different features of a phenomenal object basically become a little bit more loosely connected and start to, interface with their immediate environment and things like that. So you get kind of these like fuzzy boundaries around things, and so that's another effect. I also talked about pareidolia, which is, you look at a tree and you start seeing faces and things like that. And also, enhanced symmetry detection. I also called it lowering the symmetry detection threshold, which is its own, fascinating set of effects, very connected with valence and pleasure and stress and so on. And absolutely, you look at a wall or something like that and you will, oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. You will see kind of these tessellations happen, these clusters of tessellations, and there's kind of like this beating process of your attention that try to harmonize the different tessellations, and then you get like big clusters, and eventually you get the entirety of the visual field kind of resonating in the same way with the same wallpaper symmetry group, and so on. So that's another, I thought at the time, prime effect. Now, it's been 4 years. Maybe it might be more than 4 years. We've had way many more discussions, have read way many more papers. Really, I think it was a good approach at the time. Now I think that we can probably actually reduce these four effects to even more fundamental effects. And that is something I did talk about in that article. I also talked about in Hyperbolic Geometry of DMT Experiences, but I didn't go into, very deep detail into what could be a further algorithmic reduction of those, like four fundamental effects. And I'm not going to exactly do that today, but I will get close. I will basically talk about kind of like another paradigm for how to discuss these crazy psychedelic effects that you experience. Okay, so that is kind of there. And I should also mention that I think in the debate between functionalism and physicalism, which I will get to in the next video, it also has a lot of bearings on how you interpret a psychedelic experience. If you talk to a computer science major, researcher in AI or something like that, they're having a trip, a trip. They might talk in the language of something like, oh, I'm experiencing a kind of stack overflow, or I'm experiencing, new types of sorting algorithms for, ranking, qualities of my experience. And they might talk in that language. Or for example, they might discuss like, I'm experiencing a new type of data structure. And that's totally valid. And if that happens, it's important to point out. But what I want to say here is that I don't believe that you can actually reconstruct the low-level effects with that language itself. You need a different paradigm. But as a high-level effect, you can indeed experience all these other, computer science-y properties like new sorting algorithms, or, I'm experiencing a new type of heap allocation or a linked list in the way my perception is organized. Yeah, that absolutely happens, especially if those are, thought forms that you have trained before. I mean, psychedelics to a large extent build on your previous knowledge. You manipulate and you bring together thought forms that were pre-existing in your, mental field, and make them interact and have, I don't know, like sex, intercourse, friendships, social circles, and have them interact, and you get like new interesting things. But I do not believe that you can actually get the low-level phenomena that underlie all of that high-level phenomena just based on, computer sciencey terms. You actually need something else, which is far more related to physics. Okay, so how do you, let's say, verify what I'm going to talk about today? I actually say you should be really serious and deliberate about studying these states of consciousness. I don't think the approach of taking, LSD, 2CB and mushrooms and going to a Spangle concert or a rave or something like that is going to be the optimal environment for, really delving into the nature of consciousness. You will get very bizarre and interesting effects, but it's just like very loud and distracting and, worrisome at times. And like the music and the intensity can destroy fine level information. So, and maybe that's therapeutic for some people. And like, sure, it can be really fun. It can also be terrifying. My suggestion, very frankly, is, do as much research as you can, not only in terms of like the effects of the substance, which is, obviously you should do that, and, the pharmacology and the interactions and so on. You should ideally, meditate quite a bit before doing an experience, take it really seriously, think very deeply about a scientific topic that you're trying to work out, or, the edges of your understanding, try to load up all those like, mental constructs and thought forms that really enrich your mental life, and then take it very seriously. And basically, I would suggest something along the lines of basically laying on your bed or on the floor of a bathroom or something like that, with like actually eye shades and earplugs and decibel defense and maybe music. Music is fine, but eye shades is important. And basically as comfortable as possible, but also as sensorily deprived as possible, so that you can actually pay close attention to the phenomena that happens. Have a notebook right next to you, or a recording or something like that, and take this seriously. I mean, come on, man. these are like exotic, potentially, truly novel physical low-level effects that are going on in your brain and consciousness. And they're so poorly understood. We really need more, rational, smart people actually taking this seriously and actually paying attention to these things. So I compel you, really do so. And, in this context, I want to plug, in a sense, the fact that we're about to publish, maybe it's already published by the time this video is out, but we're about to publish a guide for how to write a high-quality trip report that is actually useful for science, both in QRI, going to be cross-posted in Quality Computing, and I also recommend reading that way before you embark on a psychedelic state of consciousness, to maximize the chances of actually, helping the world and helping yourself with this process. Okay, so let's say that you take 100 micrograms of LSD. You have you're in the bed, you have eye shades and earplugs, maybe even, well, definitely a cedar. You don't know what could happen. There's like psychotic states, very uncomfortable states. You don't know what could happen. Even if you're experienced, I still think it makes sense to have a cedar, maybe in a different room, but it doesn't matter. But like somebody who will prevent you from wandering into the streets, basically, is what I'm advocating for. And very pragmatically, I know that probably in the psychonaut community, I don't think this would be very appreciated, this suggestion, especially the more spiritual side of it. But pragmatically, I think that something like pre-dosing several hours earlier, maybe 2 hours up to 4 hours earlier, a low dose of something like phenibut could be really helpful, especially if you are anxiety prone. Now, phenibut causes horrible addiction and withdrawal, so it's something to be very careful with. But psychedelics do produce a lot of like body load and vasoconstriction, and it can be unpleasant. And if that becomes the focus of your experience, or like the amplification of some chronic pain that you have, I'm not sure you're really optimizing the experience for the benefit of your understanding and so on. So honestly, yeah, pre-dose is something like 300 milligrams, which is a pretty low dose relative to like recreational dose of phenibut. But it will just take the edge off, and it will allow you to focus on the more trippy psychedelic stuff. I mean, in higher dosages, it's going to be a trip killer or something like that. It's going to be more disorienting and stuff. But at a lows like that, it, I think, will actually be helpful. And that's what I have been hearing from a lot of people. So, a lot of people actually say that they don't trip anymore without, like, a tiny bit of phenibut before or something like that. And honestly, that sounds rational. That sounds the way to go. There's no need to like overstress the body for something like this. I don't get it. I don't know why people are so masochistic or whatever. Doesn't matter. We're rational psychonauts here, you guys. We want to actually do this right. It doesn't matter if this is an addictive drug. Let's use it, sensibly. Okay, so that is going on. Okay, so things that you will probably notice for sure is, tracer effects, looping. I have this article and video about like the nature of time, phenomenal time, and basically looping and kind of like synthesizer distortions, where basically all of your experience, there's kind of like a source of like signals in your experience, which will probably be replaying things that you have thought about recently, or you have heard. In kind of like loops and things like that. And at first, the loops will probably be basically disorienting and misaligned. Like there might be like visual loops and auditory loops and tactile loops that are kind of disconnected. But over time, there's this annealing process where they will start to synchronize. And eventually you might have kind of this multimodal integration where the entirety of your experience is looping in crazy ways. Now, if you know about the pseudo-time arrow, if you know about how phenomenal time is encoded, in these patterns of looping and tracing, you can actually use that information to your advantage in order to actually basically transform these loops into, for example, moments of eternity, or time branching, or timelessness. you can kind of like loop it, or you can take the loop and then concentrate all the arrows towards the center, and arrive at like moments of eternity, which are in some sense like probably more pleasant and probably more therapeutic than just being stuck in a loop, so to speak. And definitely this is an annealing process, so it's gonna take a little bit, if you're kind of disoriented with the loops and so on. Give it like a couple minutes of like kind of like meditating or like reshaping the loops, and you will see very interesting and new effects. Other things that I've talked about is like symmetry, for sure. Like, so basically, in our model, one of the things is that basically psychedelics change the average synaptic length of communication between your neurons. I talked a lot about this in the video about like, a rational analysis at last for 5-MeO DMT, where basically I say that regular DMT feels like these like tiny clusters of synchrony that are basically competing for your attention and making coalitions. And eventually you have kind of these like patches of synchrony that are like trying to harmonize with each other. But because there's kind of like a center of gravity for each of those patches of synchrony, and it's not the entirety of your experience. So on regular DMT, what ends up happening is you have these competing patches of symmetry that are trying to organize into these, complex shapes. And because the size of it, the size or the center of gravity for each of these patterns of synchrony is not that large, it's very coalition-based, and it's kind of an evolutionary process. And you rarely get complete coherence. And even if you get complete coherence, it's still going to be made of kind of these like different resonating patches. And that's why, you get this extraordinary, complexity and information content. And on 5-MeO DMT, on the other hand, basically it seems like you're creating these kind of quote unquote universal field where actually any two, you could say, like oscillators in your nervous system actually can synchronize with one another. So there's an annealing process that is really fast at the onset of a 5-MeO DMT, where like things are kind of like energized and they quickly synchronize, and then like the entirety of your field of awareness is basically pulsating in synchrony at something probably in the order of like 30 to 40 hertz, which you can estimate using strobe lights and seeing what frequencies actually resonate with it. And that is kind of an integrated field because it's all synchronized. And basically, I think that's more therapeutic. It's also way higher valence. It feels more blissful. The process to get there can be pretty unpleasant. I think there's like hacks to make it also extremely pleasant, especially with titration of dose and so on. But what I want to point out is that there is this basically kind of duality between temporal synchronization and patterns of visual symmetry or, sensory symmetry. Something that happens is that when you actually get synchronization of oscillators, that generates a kind of a subfield of your experience, and it will show the harmonics of that subfield. So just to give you an example, like this is on a different substance, but let's say LSD or something like that. If you're creating this topologically shielded subspace, which is like based on synchrony, it is like finely tuned, synchronized oscillators implementing, this part of your visual field, you will basically see the harmonics of it. In this case, at the top it might be these like 4 things. Here below it might be like, I don't know, like 8. Yeah, like 8. And this is a cylinder structure, so we'll also get kind of these harmonics. So something that Stephen Lehar has pointed out for, I don't know, like 30 years. That guy, he deserves so much recognition. I'm so unhappy about how the academia actually treated Stephen Lehar, because his papers are fantastic and I absolutely recommend reading them. And the guy is brilliant and really funny. And he points out that basically all of these kind of like artistic, symmetries correspond usually with the harmonics of the internal representations of our experience. And I think that's something that you can 100% verify on psychedelics. I don't know. Don't believe me? Try it yourself. Pay attention to the harmonics of synchronized subfields. It happens. Just that's what it is. Okay, so that's kind of a synchrony. There's definitely also boundary dissolution effects. And that's also based on basically synchronization. That usually, let's say how you represent the self-other divide inside your inner world simulation is based on, hey, like this construct of the self has kind of its own way of oscillating that is like at a slightly different frequency and in some sense like phi separated. Well, there's a rabbit hole in there, but like basically separated from like the oscillators that you use to represent somebody else. Of course, if you fall in love, with somebody, your internal representation of yourself and the other person may actually synchronize. And there's this feeling of boundary dissolution, which is, kind of like a deep kind of, making love with some other people, experientially. And of course, if it's reciprocated, the body language and so on will actually establish a kind of interpersonal resonance, which, I think like, and in extreme cases, you could actually probably detect the artifacts of these, meaning that the harmonics I was talking about, you can probably experience it when you're in love with somebody. You can actually feel the harmonics of the interpersonal resonance, which is its own crazy thing. And I don't think anybody has reported that, but I believe that happens. For example, MDMA, that also happens quite a bit, especially interpersonal resonance. With something like LSD, you get that type of, synchronization with other weird things. You can get it with an object, you can get it with like a sound. So it is kind of like merging your sense of self with arbitrary things around you. And with 5-MeO DMT, because everything becomes synchronized and coherent, it is the complete elimination of internal boundaries, and it feels like indeed you're all one with everything, because it's all this unified field in your own internal conscious experience. Doesn't necessarily mean you're actually merging with the entirety of the cosmos, but you're definitely in some sense merging or eliminating internal boundaries within your own experience. And LSD and other psychedelics, but let's talk about LSD. I think that in terms of like clusters of synchrony, it basically stands somewhere in between DMT, which is like tiny clusters that are competing and very fast, very high frequency, and 5-MeO DMT, which is these huge experience-wide clusters. LSD is kind of in the middle. So you get like these large patches, sometimes like encompassing like more than half of your experience. And they do kind of compete with each other, but the competition is more kind of tilted toward like merging as opposed to kind of this adversarial process. But it is difficult to actually achieve complete coherence on LSD, especially if you don't have like some serious like meditation practice already, which would actually make that easier. But basically, complete coherence on LSD is not stable, and I believe it's because the kind of center of mass or the scope of synchronization is just not that large. It doesn't encompass the entirety of your experience. So, also, I would like to mention that the like combining drugs, if you combine LSD and DMT, then you will actually get kind of the superposition of those two kind of synchronization strategies, and that will give rise to its own different state, which has its own emergent properties, but it's different. It's different than either. It's not just intensified DMT or intensified LSD. It's its own thing. That's also a fascinating thing. Okay. So all of that is kind of things that I've talked about before, and I'm almost kind of self-conscious that I'm, well, hopefully they're explained in a simpler way than before as this process continues. But I know it's half an hour in, but okay, finally, let's talk about completely new content, which is, I think, like a very fruitful paradigm to basically talk about psychedelic experience is in terms of what I might describe as a self-intersecting field. So, and there's a lot of interesting phenomena here, but basically, usually there's kind of this balance between how quickly experience is dissipating and how quickly experience is building up. And in a normal everyday state, the balance ends up being in a place that basically the emergent geometry of your experience is roughly 2.5D, and is kind of like very adaptive, and there's like basically like cybernetic processes that keep the energy range, the average amount of activation roughly within certain band. But on psychedelics, you're disrupting that, and from a physics analogy, you're kind of like exploring a different level of the Hamiltonian, meaning that the average energy is just going to be higher. Now that energy may manifest in terms of sensory quality or cognitive intensity or a sense of space and so on. But the thing is, like, it's almost kind of this physical principle that energy doesn't create it or destructed or destroyed. On something like LSD, that it's kind of true as well, because you're achieving kind of a different homeostatic level. The energy range will roughly be dependent on the dose. So you can, sure, with attention, you can make most of the energy be concentrated in, visual field or bodily tactile sensations or something like that. But the point is that the average energy, if you aggregate the intensity of each of these channels, it will be roughly constant throughout the trip. I mean, modulo some other property. I mean, there are spikes of energy, but the weighted average over something like a 2-minute period or maybe 3-minute period will be pretty constant on a given period, on a period of time, while the LSD intensity is roughly the same. And yeah, I mean, psychedelics will increase, what part of the Hamiltonian you're exploring. And you can basically think of these as kind of a slightly hyperbolic sheet. So like, rather than the world sheet, basically this depth map of your experience, having this kind of 2.5D structure, on psychedelics, you will have kind of this curved sheet, kind of this curved sheet of experience. It's going to be pretty wrinkly. And basically, this kind of like sheet, I mean, this is a Euclidean sheet, I wish they would sell hyperbolic blankets. I actually think there would be a really good uses for that, especially for parties and things like that. Excuse me for a second. Sorry. But yeah, basically, by kind of creating folds here, I'm kind of exemplifying it, and basically a lot of field properties actually arise on psychedelics. Now, again, I don't think this is like, well, I mean, maybe it is a literal physical field. I mean, ultimately it is, but the geometry, I think it's like emergent out of these like basically clusters of synchrony, computing clusters of synchrony, and it's kind of like your visual field, rather than being, kind of like this flat or 2.5D structure, it will have kind of these like wrinkle properties. And, a lot of like field properties can be experienced on psychedelics. So you may experience, for example, like tensing, like the field is going to be tense in some moments. Parts of the field can be tensed. You may also experience basically kind of tensing and relaxation. Also different types of buzzing. So the sheet can kind of like wrinkle in particular ways. And if it wrinkles in particular way in a large enough like surface area of it, that will have kind of its own frequency. And it will kind of like entrain other parts of the sheet. And that's kind of like the process where like your visual field develops these symmetries, and they synchronize, and you get like, a full tessellation in the entirety of your visual field. Yeah, that's kind of like these little patches of like different particular frequency buzzing kind of entrain the whole thing, and in the end you get, this tessellation. But the crazy things is that, all of these tessellations that happen, they're not entirely flat. They always have kind of a 3-dimensional component, a depth to them. And in that sense, that's also kind of a signature of it being a hyperbolic sheet, that you're not experiencing perfectly flat surfaces. Well, if you are, oftentimes the wrinkling is going to happen elsewhere, just as if you're trying to flatten a hyperbolic surface, that's something that happens. You get kind of like that wrinkling. You also absolutely get things like twisting, twisting, and you can also get kind of those like symmetrical buzzing, but in polar coordinates all of a sudden. So like, rather than it being like, in a surface, kind of this twisting, the twisting here can also be kind of symmetrical, and that itself will generate its own type of like resonance and entrainment. And you can arrive at something that feels like this like spiral that is actually fractal, because it's kind of this polar, and that's like, I think, what underlies form constants and Kuvler constants and things like that. Although I believe, sorry if I'm being arrogant, but I'm adding way more detail that any of those theories are explaining, and plus they're functionalists, and anyway, it doesn't matter. We can go way further than that by talking in the kind of language that I'm outlining here. Absolutely, you also have field properties like curling. Again, that's kind of like patches of it, or kind of like twisting. You also have divergence, because parts of the field can curl. You can form vortex, and also you can get anti-vortex. And I think like a lot of the ineffability of psychedelic states of consciousness have to do with like generating anti-vortex in your experiential field, and that is where the attention field lines are converging in two directions, and then where they meet, they diverge. So those are very weird phenomenal objects because they don't have a center of attention. It's kind of this weird dual, and it feels like you're contracting and expanding at the same time. And I think like that's an anti-vortex. I think is a lot of what underlies a lot of kind of these, at least in meditation and LSD, this kind of boundary dissolution with the cosmos. You're kind of like simultaneously kind of pushing in one direction, but also moving towards infinity at the same time. And you can have lots of those, depending on the dose and the intensity. Oh yeah, there's this other fascinating thing, which is I love this term my sister recently made me aware of, which is chronotopic, which is I believe in film especially, which is basically the organization of events in space and time. And different films, they have like very different ways of exposing what happens in space and time. I think I'm halfway through, but I'm seeing this movie called Mind Games, and the introduction. If I don't even think you need to watch the whole movie. Like just watch the first like 4 minutes or 5 minutes. There's a extremely interesting way of doing like a chronotopic organization of events in space and time in that beginning stage. And there's a sober medium of thought, the way in which we organize events in space and time. In psychedelic states of consciousness, that changes, and is basically like you're using this hyperbolic sheet to encode different things that are happening or have happened even in your lifetime and so on. And different sections of it will encode, they will have kind of like their own space-time signature. Now, these are representations because, of course, the entirety of the experience is happening at once anyway, which is why, the feeling of passage of time is an illusion, and the pseudo-time arrow, and, that whole rabbit hole. But, as a whole experience, yes, you do represent the unfolding of causality in space and time. And in some sense, processing trauma on psychedelics is a little bit easier because you can actually, in a sense, load up all of these different components of a situation. Scott Alexander recently wrote about this, and we also have a bunch of content on that about how you can use neural annealing to treat trauma. It's a whole topic as well. But the point is that the chronotopic organization of events in space and time in a psychedelic state can be really complex. So you can have kind of like, hey, here is me when I was a 5-year-old. Here is me in what I believe is the future. Here's like various branches of what could happen, and you're seeing all of that at once. And sometimes like they may also kind of like start resonating with one another, or like merging or unifying. And yeah, all of those like interesting field effects will also happen. And sometimes that actually helps in the processing or the thinking process. Sometimes it's detrimental. I mean, like these artifacts of perception, it's kind of this confusion that like, it's not the semantic content necessarily that is actually dictating how this world sheet is evolving. It's more the math of the field-like behavior of the psychedelic state. That's actually how what is dictating how this sheet is evolving over time. This field. You can also experience dissonance. In terms of like signatures of unpleasant states, I mean, like most people will describe a psychedelic state as like highly tense. That's a very typical description. And indeed, a lot of your sensory field will be very tense. And I think like that's a signature of high energy. You will also experience kind of feelings of resistance. And, there's I think a lot of wisdom in Shenzhen Young's idea that like suffering basically is kind of a combination of like pain times energy times resistance. And yeah, I mean, basically, that's also where the wisdom of like don't resist a psychedelic state comes from, because if you resist it, basically that itself will be kind of like micro experiential moments of suffering, and that's something that you want to avoid. So don't resist, the tension, don't the pain or the pressure. Just kind of like let it happen and dissipate, and you will see that basically the field of your experience will kind of like self-organize in a way so as to dissipate the tension, which is also something you can train on meditation. It's probably one of the best instructions that you can practice, is kind of dissolving micro tensions in your experiential field. Talking about that, you will realize that also a lot of like the thinking process in and of itself is based on information sensitive gradients of discomfort. And in some sense, you cannot actually have thoughts without like at least a modicum of discomfort. You can have a lot of totally blissful experiences, or experiences that are on net totally positive valence, but these, micro experiences of tension and discomfort and dissonance encode a lot of information, and that's difficult to do away with without also getting rid of the thinking process in and of itself. Now, of course, maybe from the point of view of maximizing the therapeutic value, actually focusing on the positives makes sense, similar to the instruction of focusing on silence. So you also experience feelings of relaxation, which I would describe as pleasant. They're one of the signatures of positive valence. Release, the feeling of release. In Buddhism, they say, the first noble truth, life is suffering, but also there is the cessation of suffering. It's almost kind of, these feelings of tension and stress is a suffering, or maybe a building block of the suffering. It's definitely not the whole story. And then there's the feeling of relaxation. And that is blissful, and that is pleasant. And then there's also the rate at which the relaxation is happening. So there's almost kind of a power component from a physical unit's point of view. And then you get things such as, well, there's maybe a unit for positive valence, and that's a whole topic that I'm very deeply exploring right now. And also, another signature of very positive valence is resonance. So you get this kind of soliton-like experiences where a component of your visual or experiential field enters in resonance. And that can store, well, it will have its own signature. It's a signature of consonance, dissonance, and noise, and that itself will encode a valence. And that's something you can study very carefully. And again, if you're a physicist, a mathematician, or just somebody smart and interested in these topics, please like when you experience this sense of resonance, focus on the consonance and dissonance and noise signatures of it to verify, and maybe write a blog post and tell us if it's true. But I'm pretty convinced that actually that is more or less one of the signatures of valence here. And yeah, a lot of field behavior in that domain. There's also this interplay between expansion and contraction that the field is experiencing all the time on a psychedelic state. And as a consequence, you actually get these fascinating energy minimizing configurations. So that's why you get a ton of minimal surfaces. Like when you take a wire that is kind of like weirdly shaped, and then you submerge it in soapy water, and you get kind of this the surface of a soap bubble in that shape. The shape of that will basically be its lower energies, the lowest energy configuration that connects with the boundary condition. That is basically the shape of the wire. And that shape will be basically minimizing the energy, and also as a consequence minimizing the surface of it. Surface minimization. And there's like a lot of math about it, and I'm pretty convinced that it's a huge component of psychedelic experiences. And the crazy beautiful hyperbolic architecture that you can basically construct, whether it's in DMT or LSD or 2CB or whatnot, will be often saturated with these crazy energy and surface minimization configurations. That's something for a physicist to take a close look at. The next Feynman, please, take LSD in these conditions and study the equations of this energy minimization effect. It's something that been verified by a number of people. It's not just n of 1, And if you look carefully at a lot of psychedelic replications, you will see a ton of energy minimization phenomena also, which is and it's connected with the free energy principle and prediction coding. Again, all of those are pieces of the puzzle. They're not the full story, but it's as an important component. Another thing to point out is that the semantic content of the experience will be highly related with the properties of the field. So let's say that there's like a very heavy topic that you're trying to process. If it's really heavy, it will actually perhaps create such tension in this field so as to become a kind of black hole. And yeah, you can actually kind of simulate quasi physical simulations of something like, Einstein's equations of general relativity. I mean, I'm not saying that, the psychedelic experience has anything to do with gravity. No. But some of those equations can be emulated with a field-like behavior in some configurations within some parameter ranges, such that, yeah, you can kind of visualize an experience and feel, like orbits and things like that, or the effect of a very intense black hole. And also, the curvature of the field will be proportional to kind of how tense it feels. And oftentimes that will encode like emotionally charged objects and properties of thought and events that happen in your life. So it's kind of crazy, that you're using these field properties in order to process, emotional content. It's fascinating, but once you notice, it's pretty obvious that's happening. But most people never notice. Most people get just caught up in the semantic content. They come back from the trip, and all they have to report is the semantic content, not the field-like properties of the experience, which is actually where the nectar is when it comes to advancing science in this domain. Also, turbulent flow. You will see a lot of turbulent flow in this sheet. I mean, especially when you relax and things like that, you will see kind of ripples of different spatio-temporal frequencies kind of cascade into higher frequencies, like smaller eddies and so on. And that's a good energy dissipation. There's like a whole lot of stuff to talk about, and actually don't want to get too much into it right now. Another huge topic is the dimensionality of the experience. And here's a trade-off. There's basically a trade-off between the hyperbolicity, basically how saddled the experiential field is, how curved it is, and how high dimensional it is. Because you can trade one for the other. And actually, I think that in these kind of higher levels of the Hamiltonian of a conscious experience, most of things are either high dimensional or hyperbolic. And there's kind of one or the other. And there's going to be patches. Some of those are high dimensional, some of those are hyperbolic. But if you know what to do, if you know what to focus on, you can actually, a meditation that I would recommend, and I think is probably very, very, very good for you, is meditate on high dimensions. Basically, try to reward the parts of the field that are high dimensional so that there is more of it. Oh gosh. And then like crazy things will happen. Really crazy things. So one of the signatures of high dimensionality in consciousness is the coupling or synchronization between sensory modalities. So as I was saying at the beginning, you can have kind of these looping effects that happen only in the visual field or only the auditory field or tactile field, but if you anneal them so that they start to synchronize, you can create this unified field that contains multimodal representations that are coherent. I talked a little bit about this in the other video called Why Does DMT Feel So Real? And one of the reasons is because DMT creates these high-dimensional, multimodally coherent experiences. And that is very real. It feels very real. On LSD, it's not automatic, but it happens stochastically at random. But if you know what to look for, you can meditate and basically focus on that and kind of weave together a high-dimensional nucleation of your field and then propagate it elsewhere. And then kind of converge on that high-dimensional space and then enter in a state of resonance in it. That is amazing. That's a fascinating process to undergo with. And I actually believe that process is probably one of the most healthy things you could do on a psychedelic state for the long term. that basically leads to really good properties, which is something that Shenzhen Yang also talks a lot about, which is increasing concentration power, increasing sensory clarity, and equanimity. And I believe that high dimensional states of consciousness basically by default tend to contain more of these three things. And the more you do them, the more you concentrate on them, especially on meditation. But, when you have a psychedelic experience, it's an opportunity to basically do the, turn the dial up to 11 and then like do this in a very, very intense way. That is going to increase all of those properties. And that's probably what your nervous system is going to be the happiest about in the long term. Now, fractality. The high dimensionality also is related to fractality. I was talking about how, when you twist the field of experience, you may have kind of these like polar coordinate symmetries and resonances. Well, doing that type of process basically connects your experience in this crazy, I know it sounds bad from a scientific point of view, but it's kind of true, which is it creates a holographic space where basically every part of the experience encodes the entirety of the information in the rest of the experience. So again, with the symmetry theory of valence, that would be a high valence state of consciousness because the overall information content is very low and it has no dissonance, but it can be very oddly shaped. And, in the upper ranges of the Hamiltonian, there is a ton of super crazy, irreducible mathematical objects that are these, holographic fractal structures. Which on DMT, they happen spontaneously a lot. On LSD, you kind of have to work to get them. On higher doses of LSD, they also happen spontaneously. But let's say on 100 micrograms, you kind of need to meditate, combine meditation with the state in order to create those fascinating thought forms. And there's so many solutions. I mean, I'm not going to say there's only, these like polar coordinate fractal is only one, because that's only one. There's only one of them. But you have kind of like Julia sets, continuous Julia sets, which are a type of fractal. You also have kind of these like crazy light show experiences where kind of different parts of your visual field seem to be kind of like be light emitters. And at first the light emitters are uncoordinated, but then over time with this annealing process, they start to be coordinated and eventually they become coordinated in a fractal way that is interlocking. And then for a brief moment, they can kind of all move together. You can do operations like, they all converge or they all kind of do this. You can do weird things like that. And this is just kind of, just a hand, but like imagine a fractal hand. There's this and then a smaller one and then a smaller one and smaller one. And maybe not infinity, but like there's quite a few levels of recursion and all of them are aligned. And then there is a time period where you can actually manipulate them simultaneously and you get kind of this like aperture effect. Well, that's another one, just one. You also have crazy hyperbolic honeycomb type of fractal organization where all of your experience is basically organized in a fractal structure like this. And also that has intense resonance and symmetry, and it all will evolve together. Now, again, on DMT, you get these things, quote unquote, for free, super crazy high dimensional stuff. On LSD, you need probably a little bit of meditation, especially to make them manageable. Being able to do something interesting with them. But and then these can become like building blocks of like further things. So you can continue to increase the dimensionality by kind of tuning the field of your experience into these fractal holographic states, then remembering them and then using them as building blocks for even higher dimensional stuff. And that's why, people talk about there's layers and layers and layers of, heavens and higher dimensions. And that's true because you can use these building blocks for even more crazy high dimensional symmetrical fractal stuff. It's also important to point out that the entirety of the sheet actually contains information. And I think a lot of subconscious processing is actually going on at the fine level structure. And very crazy phenomena also happen sometimes where you may like process a very intricate or complex event that happened in your life or like a math problem, seriously, or like whatever it is that you're trying to figure out. And at first it will be in the foreground. You will do kind of like a partial progress to see it in various different ways. and then you kind of get bored of it because you can't figure out more, or you get distracted. Distractibility is very high on these substances, and then that part of the field will kind of like migrate to the periphery of your field, and then you may be looking at another part of the field, but that intricate structure is still in the periphery, and you kind of like can kind of like pull the sheet back again, and you will reconstruct the shape again, the intricate information processing and thought forms that you generated, and I think that in light of that, I think like confusion is kind of unpleasant because it's kind of eliminating that fine level structure. Confusion, I mean, low dimensional states of consciousness like aggression and anger and sadness and despair and so on, they tend to, as a consequence and like as a consequence of the dissonance, kind of like overwrite that fine level structure, which can leave you feeling kind of lost. But if you have a psychedelic experience, a clean, really good LSD, maybe with a little bit of Fendibut or whatever, just not distracted by anxiety and in the sensorily deprived state, a clean psychedelic state of consciousness, also combined with meditation, all of those good factors, that metadata, these like wrinkly data structures that you've been exploring, it will continue to be there in the edges, and you can like revisit and revisit and revisit and build and build and build, and after 5 hours or so, you have so many insights encoded in this hyperbolic field, and that's beautiful. It's amazing that you can do that, and I think that's another reason why to take this seriously, because the difference between doing this at a Spangle concert versus actually in a really good optimal space is the difference between having that metadata be completely lost or not. And a lot of the insights from a psychedelic state is going to be in that metadata, and for it to come back later, you have to exercise them and meditate on it. And again, take it seriously, guys. This is very valuable research with a lot of valuable information. Don't get rid of that metadata. Also, basically subconscious processing, like you can focus on the noise of your experience, and that itself will oftentimes be related to some kind of oftentimes you're going to be working on a problem and you don't even know what problem it is that you're working on until you've done kind of like enough of these like micro adjustments until like the shape becomes clear, and then you realize like, oh gosh, I was actually processing, I don't know, how my father didn't praise me enough when I was a kid or whatever, like or a math problem or a social problem, like whatever it may be. There's a lot of like kind of like under the, it's not exactly under the hood, I mean it's still there, but it's in the fine level structure of the field, kind of like unwrinkling and re-annealing these like microstructures. It's actually doing a lot of very, very crazy advanced information processing. And just to kind of like wrap up here, I do think that dimensionality is a very good target. So if you do focus on the high dimensionality and use that as the annealing target, it will become like more DMT like, and there is a quality of DMT, not necessarily at the super high doses, but like like 10 milligrams or something like that everything is incredibly crisp. You have this very crisp field of experience, and I think it's almost like the foam that underlies experience. I don't know if the quantum foam, but whatever it is, these like flickering, chaotic substrate becomes smarter. So, and that feels on DMT. I mean, on DMT, you take a little bit of DMT and you feel like, wow, like I didn't know space could become like smarter. Could become like, it feels very much like a super advanced alien technology. And maybe it is kind of an alien technology in a sense, but and I think that's high dimensional phenomenal spacetime at the microstructural level, in the very high frequencies. And if you do that, that is so consonant, so beautiful, and so efficient at information processing. Maybe it's very expensive from the point of view of calories? I don't know. And definitely I think it needs a lot of maintenance. You need to like continue to renew it, or otherwise it dissipates into something else. But yeah, when people talk about like, you know, the beautiful high clarity, you know, not confused or disturbed or anything, like high clarity, euphoric and beautiful, hyperdimensional, hyper intelligent sense of you know, going to a different realm of experience. I think it's that is like this high dimensional microorganization of phenomenal space-time, and it's so beautiful. I mean, in the long term, I suspect we will probably all be there. I mean, like, there is a sense when you try DMT that you realize like, okay, yeah, some of this is very anxiogenic, some of this is very scary and so on, but there's an aspect of the experience that seems just really advanced, like a really advanced form of consciousness, form of organizing space-time. And that is probably going to be recruited either by our future selves or our descendants in order to just actually have way better lives. And that is, yeah, I mean, I think like an improvement to that would probably be even a better, you know, hedonic calculus than just being on MDMA all the time. Although there's like there's a little bit of overlap. I think that is like even better. Yeah, I mean, when you take DMT, it almost feels like, oh my gosh, there's like a teeming multiverse of other entities that are already in that high dimensional space. And you feel like we're missing out, that humanity is just, you know, messing around, just not focusing on the things that matter, because there's this high dimensional space we could be inhabiting that is way more loving and way smarter, can, you know, solve conflicts way better than we can. So yeah, focus on that. Try to introspect on it and bring back as much information as you can, because that's where the good stuff is, as far as I can tell. The last thing is that I strongly think that meditation is highly synergistic with psychedelic states of consciousness to be able to bring more back. For example, if you've been doing loving kindness meditation every day for like 3 months or like a year or something like that, and then you take a psychedelic, any psychedelic, that meditation, you know, effort will show. Like, you will notice how now you have kind of the ability to generate positive, wholesome, universally loving vibrations and regions of your field, of your experiential field. They're like smooth and beautiful and devoid of tension and suffering, that can kind of like spread waves of love. I mean, again, I'm talking poetically. In the end, I think there's going to be a field, a mathematical field, set of equations that describe actually what is metta, what is loving kindness, in terms of the field microstructural properties of the experience. But yeah, you can instantiate that. You can kind of make a shrine inside of your experience, kind of like, you know, the Buddha of compassion, or Krishna, or Jesus, or emptiness, or whatever, you know, cosmos, universe, whatever. I don't care about that. But the point is that if it's like universal love, you can create this super grounding and beautiful region of your experience, and you will be very happy that you've been meditating often when you do this, because it's gonna show, it's gonna happen, and it's gonna stabilize the experience. It's gonna make it way more fruitful. You're gonna remember more. And I think it's the same with like other meditation techniques, like equanimity, for example, may manifest as much more of a free flow. And like Mike Johnson recently posted an interview that he did with Shenzhen Yang in opentheory.net, which I'll put in the description, which talks about like equanimity as kind of this complete absence of resistance. And I think like in a psychedelic state, that can also manifest in kind of this sheet, hyperbolic sheet, just like basically being able to unfold without disturbances. And it's just a way better experience on the whole. So yeah, 2 thumbs up for meditation. I think especially something like loving kindness or equanimity and stuff like that, it's going to be a game changer in terms of how you experience a psychedelic state of consciousness. And I think that's about it. Um, we covered a lot of content, and I know this is just the preamble to the next video, but we're taking these very seriously, guys. So, oh yeah, the last thing is, if you want to see this type of research, this type of descriptions, this type of paradigms really pushing the boundary in how we understand exotic states of consciousness, and for the benefit of all sentient beings, hopefully, understanding loving kindness and so on. One of the things you could do is support the Qualia Research Institute financially. We're honestly just like bottlenecked by funding at this point, and there's like so many very rigorous academic studies that we are pretty much set up to conduct and just write out the results and publish them, and we just don't have enough funding for that. So that's one of the things you could do to help. Of course, there's many other ways, and one of the things I've been telling people is that every time you do something like loving kindness meditation, in my mind you are helping QRI as well. Well, you're helping every group of people who is trying to reduce suffering in the world. So do that as well. And of course, if you really have a passion for this stuff, and you're like technically advanced, or you have a lot of meditation experience, high verbal fluency, stuff like that, also like reaching out for volunteering. But just being very, very honest here, the main bottleneck is funding. So yeah, maybe help us with that. So all right, infinite bliss, and thank you so much. Chat to you another time.